Merry Christmas Eve, everybody. It's Victor from Need Some Introduction. Awaiting some family to arrive and still wrapping Christmas presents, believe it or not. But Apple TV, if you are a fan of Severance, Apple TV has provided us a little early Christmas present. Just go to your Apple TV app on your device of choice, go over to Severance, and look at the bonus material and the first 8 minutes of the season premiere of Season 2 of Severance, which is coming January 17th, is available to watch right now. I've been wanting to kick off this review of Season 1. Something I've been doing is watching those episodes again. It's been nearly a full 3 years since that season of television. So I've been rewatching those episodes. I'm almost halfway through my rewatch. So in this episode, I'm going to walk through those first 8 minutes of the season of the show. And then I'm going to dig into the really thrilling Season 2 trailer, which dropped about a week ago. And then some observations from my rewatch of part of the season. And then at the end, a republication of the conversation I had with Sona nearly 3 years ago, as I mentioned, discussing the first 2 episodes of Season 1 of Severance. And if you do make it that far into the episode, apologies for the audio quality. I almost considered not publishing it at all. I did have issues with my old podcast publishing platform. And this is right around the time when this episode was published, when I switched to another provider. But that doesn't explain the quality of the audio, because the subsequent episodes in the Severance recaps, they sound totally fine. They sound about the same as these do. So your mileage may vary depending on your opinion of all that. But for some reason, this first episode just doesn't sound good. I did remaster it to try to make it listenable, because I do think the content is good. So stick around for that. And if you do decide to continue to listen to the Severance recap episodes, I did listen through them very briefly, and the rest of them sound pretty normal. But anyway, all those caveats in place, I did think I wanted to republish this conversation. It's a good conversation. Obviously, it was our first experience with the show at all. So if you are watching for the first time, you may appreciate that. But you probably don't want to hear this content that I'm going to dive into right now if you haven't seen the show. So if it's your first time watch, do skip ahead to those recap episodes. Check the show notes for timestamps, because as I dig into these newly available 8 minutes of footage, plus, of course, the trailer itself, there's a presumption that you have seen Season 1, and there is a huge spoiler if you have not seen the absolutely thrilling, one of the best episodes of television of the past few years, the finale of Season 1. So as the first 8 minutes kick off this preview of the season, we hear on a black screen, we hear the different characters in those moments, those final moments, the thrilling, truly thrilling final moments of Season 1. Helly, her innie, is announcing in this very public way that they're being tortured inside of the Lumen facilities. I'm getting goosebumps just remembering it all. We have Mark screaming out his wife's name. We have Irv screaming out for Bert. And of course, that chilling Mark yelling out, "She's alive," when we see Mark awaken again inside of the elevator. At this point, we have nearly a full 2 minutes of Mark, Adam Scott's character, running through the maze. Just this week on my recap of The Agency, I named the episode, despite all my rage, I am just a rat in a rat cage, because the name of the episode was Rat Cage. Well, this is truly, despite all his rage, he is trapped, or maybe fear rather than rage, he is trapped in a cage, or a maze is really what it is. By the way, we have seen in Season 1, once again, assuming you've seen Season 1, PD has left behind a map of the facilities. There's one outside of Lumen. There's one inside of Lumen. And I do not have that maze up in front of me, but I would like to map this out old school. If you've ever used to play those old, this is dating me for sure, those old text-based video games like Zork, for example, where you needed to actually write the maze. Each turn, you would say, here's another room, and describe it some way. Basically what they're doing in the facility itself. But I've seen multiple Reddit boards where they already, from Season 1, had carefully analyzed the maze maps that were left behind. And I would love to see, and I'm sure this will exist soon, if the maze, the Lumen maze that he runs through here, maps onto the diagram we've seen previously. And as I'm watching this, by the way, this scene is going like 2 minutes almost, 2 minutes of this 8 minute preview. It would be very funny if it had just gone on and on and on. And they're like, there's your 8 minutes, everybody. That's what you get. But that's not the case. As I'm watching this, I'm thinking, well, did it ever take him this long to get to his usual cubicle? But of course, that's not where he's going. He's actually headed to wellness because he wants to see Miss Casey. And really incredible production design here and just attention to detail. He walks into the wellness room It looks generically like any other room, of course, because that whole lush experience with the sound and the greenery was all just artifice, and it's all been removed. I love the details that you can see where a whiteboard, for example, had been on the wall before. Of course, if you've ever been in an office space, you see these kind of artifacts in these rooms of how they were used previously. So all the details impeccable here. Also, creepily, there is someone out of focus in the distance, and we never identify who this is. This might just be security who will eventually be notifying Milchick that Mark is back in the building because Milchick is on his way. When he does eventually work his way back to macro data refinement, he finds 3 new cube mates. Aaliyah Shawkat, very recognizable here. Bob Balaban is also here. And a new actor speaking Italian, Stefano Coronante. This is when Milchick comes with a bunch of blue balloons with his face on them. Welcome back, Mark. This is all a cold open, and we get the title here. I do hope that we continue to get the title sequence from before, or maybe a slightly modified version of it. A deeply disturbing title sequence, very memorable. Milchick lets Mark know that he now has a new office. At his old desk is now Miss Huang, who looks like she is a teenager, and perhaps barely a teenager. He starts to ask a question as to why exactly is there a child working here? Milchick, of course, is in Miss Cobell's old office, and there's some combination here of truth and lies, I'm sure, to be revealed over the course of this season. He mentions that the team has not been fired, that Helene and Irv made contact with people outside of Lumen, which of course we witnessed at the end of season 1. Dylan discovered what was happening, his outie, and apparently has still chosen to not re-enter. At least that's the story we're hearing now. And Milchick very humorously presents him with a newspaper heavily redacted. I did pause this and look through some of the details here. I found it very interesting that the outside names have been redacted, but he can see the names with their last initials, the way that they identify each other as innies. That remains visible in this newspaper clipping, which indicates that this has been a breakthrough moment. There is now a social movement and a desire for reform of the severed workforce. Some Redditors have already noted that this newspaper has headlines that are out of date, so this could be all a mock-up. And he is careful to take it away quickly from him, so not something they want to have too heavily scrutinized. Milchick mentions that Miss Cobell has been fired by Lumen. And some more details. I don't know, and I'd probably have to rewatch the last episode to fully understand what is intentionally vague here and what is my misremembering of it. Milchick reminds Mark that Miss Cobell had to perform this Kier hymn as part of her exit, and that Mark witnessed this. Now, I do remember this, or maybe I'm incepting that into my own mind, but I do remember that occurring in that final episode of season 1. And then Milchick seems sincerely disturbed by the fact that he had to lock up Adam, presumably when that switch flipped in the final moments of season 1. We discover here as well that it's been 5 months since Mark has been back, and they're scapegoating Patricia Arquette's character as the evildoer here, the primary evildoer. And to some extent, that's completely understandable, and yet I'm not sure this is the full story. I do love that, and I've suspected this, honestly, even in my watch of the show, that Miss Cobell, here it is indicated that Miss Cobell actually wanted to have a kind of throuple with these 2 versions of, a very funny line, by the way, with the 2 Marks and herself. I'm not sure if there was a sexual attraction there, although it does seem like there may have been. But more importantly, there is definitely a fixation she had, and she was definitely spying on him, and she was definitely crossing boundaries, and that was clear even in watching season 1. So what they're telling him here is somewhat accurate, or maybe they're hiding a bigger lie with this truth. It could also be what they told Milchick to keep him on board. Maybe Milchick is more honorable than we give him credit for. Maybe there are different levels of corruption within these worker bees within Lumen. And then, of course, the most disturbing part of all of this is that whatever happened on the outside, and I'm sure it will be explored maybe in a flashback over the course of this continuing episode, or maybe in later episodes, that the rest of his coworkers chose to not go back. And yet Mark did. Mark could not wait to go back. Now, that's extremely disturbing. Is he so committed to doubling down on this self-destruction because he cannot deal with the death of his wife, which really was his character in season 1? But maybe, just maybe, he is suspicious of what's happening inside of the offices. And he thinks by allowing his innie back, it may provide further clues if he does start to believe what his innie said when he was out. And then the episode ends with Mark pushing back, something he hasn't done much before, and staring down Milchick and saying, I'd like to hear it from them, which of course will take some doing, although they could theoretically record messages from the Audis, and we'll have to wait and see how that plays out. You may be worried, by the way, if you have seen these 8 minutes or not, that the rest of the team is not coming back for the rest of the season. They couldn't get them all back. But that is not the case, by the way. If you have seen the trailer, they are all going to reunite at some point. I do hope that they don't drag this on for half the season, for example, and that they get the gang back together relatively quickly. We'll have to wait and see, because that's all we get of episode 1. It may happen by the end of episode 1. Who knows? I don't, but I guess many people do know. The people who've seen it and worked on the show, but I do not know. That's all we know for now. Just a tease, just a little tease. All right, on to the trailer for season 2. If you don't want to be spoiled, then once again, skip ahead. This is a really thrilling trailer. The use of I'll Be There, by the way, a song that I always found creepy because, sure, I'll Be There sounds like such a great sentiment, but what is up with the chilling minor keys that are the foundation to the verses of this song? And this re-edit of the song is certainly creepy. They'll be there, yes. Those innies will be trapped in there forever. But if that song ever chilled you slightly, this version of it definitely will. And of course, the trailer is very interesting in conjunction with those 8 minutes, because we see in the very beginning of the trailer that Mark is racing through the severed floor. Milchick is hot on his heels, and he's trying to go to Cobell/Milchick's, who, depending on who's in control at this point in this trailer, we don't know, and is trying to reach out to the board via the speaker plugged into the desk. But interspersed in this are flashbacks to Milchick with Audi Mark, convincing him to go back, saying that the version of you inside of there is happy. So, of course, this proves a lie, that the Audi Mark wasn't enthusiastically trying to go back inside, but needed to be cajoled. And then we see, as we saw in those first 8 minutes, the presentation of the cover story, I assume, that Lumen has, that these 4 are now heroes to the outside world. And as I mentioned, of course, if we were worried that they would not reunite, we do see all of them inside of the severed floor discussing what happened on the outside. And of course, the big revelation here is that we see Mark telling the others that Miss Casey's actually Audi Mark's wife. And now it's his mission now to release Miss Casey from the severance floor. We see Audi Mark confronting Miss Cobell, or Miss Selvig as he knew her. So apparently at some point he is informed of her dual nature. And of course he desperately wants to know, what does she know and why has she been manipulating him, or at least observing him? There's some interesting flashes here as well. We see Milchick looking much more nefarious. We see that the story goes outside of Lumen. We see the characters on this cliff, this snow-covered cliff. We see Mark S. on a motorcycle. We see some interaction behind some of the executives, or one of the executives at Lumen, trying to convince these innies that they're doing great work, some of the greatest work that the humanity has ever done, according to this story they're trying to convince them of. And some really fascinating visuals here. You see some interesting use of animation. We see a different type of office party, a watermelon carving of a character's face, for anybody who loved those. And of course, we see the goats. Sona's not happy to see these, I'm sure, but we see a lot more of the goats on this pretty amazing set, this rolling field with a corporate-like drop ceiling. But apparently later in this very scene, we see somebody in a very occult-looking costume crest this same hill surrounded by these goats. So something quite nefarious is afoot. I guess if I have any concerns here is what direction the show is taking. Hopefully it doesn't just tantalize more mysteries without solving any of them. But I found season 1 so cleverly plotted that I do have a lot of confidence in these showrunners. I also don't think they're giving away too much because, especially after seeing those 8 minutes, I would assume that more than what we see in this trailer, more than half of what we see in this trailer, I should say, is directly from episode 1. So I don't think they're giving away too much, although I have a feeling that some of those outside scenes probably come much later in season 2. All right, before we get back to the old content, just some reminders. We continue to watch The Agency. There's a whole bunch of films coming out here at the end of the year that I might be watching within the next day or two, actually. The Brutalist, Nosferatu, Baby Girl, all in cinemas. I'll have some end-of-year content put together, some conversations with people shouting out their year-end favorites. If you'd like to participate, make sure you write us an email and send it to needssomeintroduction@gmail.com, or check the link in the show notes. Any show or movie that really stood out this year that we did cover on the podcast, or maybe we did not, and you'd like to promote them to a broader audience, send us an email or a voice memo and send it to our email address. And of course, one more thing we probably will be covering in the very near future is the season 2 of Squid Game, which is coming out on Thursday. One of the true phenomena of the past few years. Still to this day, Netflix's most successful series, and very curious to see how they extend it after that massively critically and commercially successful season 1. Perhaps a second season is unnecessary, maybe even redundant of that show, but I'm very curious to see what these filmmakers come up with, because that was a very solid season 1. So that's all coming just this week. And then, of course, Severance coming mid-January, and more conversations, more of those republishings of conversations, along with some new conversations about that first season of Severance. All right, have a Merry Christmas, everybody. I'll talk to you soon.
Hello, my name is Mark S., and I have, of my own free accord, elected to undergo the procedure known as severance. I give consent to sever my memories between my work life and my personal life. I acknowledge that once the procedure is complete, I will be unable to access my personal memories whilst on the severed floor.
Say gratitude.
Nor will I retain work memories.
Hey!
Sorry, when I return home at the end of the day. I make these statements freely. Do I know you?
My name's Petey. I'm from work.
So, we're friends?
I'm your best friend. Nothing is what they say. I used to think it would take a monster to put someone in a place like that office. Especially if the person was himself. If you want to know what's going on down there, you'll find the beginning of a very long answer.
What's happening?
What is it we actually do here?
Next, let's talk about Severance. So a little backstory here on this. This is a new show directed mostly, I think the first half of the season is directed by Ben Stiller, who's made quite a career of directing recently. And I've always been a fan of his directing. I mean, he directed Reality Bites. He directed Tropic Thunder, which I think is hilarious, by the way. If no one's ever seen that, it's great. Also directed, on the darker side of things, Escape at Dannemora with Patricia Arquette also, which got a bunch of Emmy nominations a couple of years ago. And I don't know if did you ever see that, Sona?
It was always on my to-do list, to watch list, and I never actually got around to it.
I mean, it's not comedic at all, but the tone is still a little off on it, is my experience of it. However, the performances are incredible, like really great performances, and very psychological to see the reason these people are doing some of the crazy things they're doing, especially the Patricia Arquette character, which I think she won an Emmy, and she was just incredible in that show. So, and here she is again in this show with Stiller again directing. This is a show that had very few laugh lines, honestly, the first time I watched it. And then I rewatched it, had to rewatch it because I was kind of half asleep when I watched the first time around. So I rewatched it to take notes. And I laughed a lot the second time around, I guess because I wasn't trying to follow the plot or something. So I was able to just laugh at some of these very subtle jokes. Go ahead.
There definitely is an Office Space type of feeling to it,
Yes.
right?
Mm-hmm.
Of that drudgery of office life and cubicles and office formalities and bureaucracy and all of that type of stuff. I would say it is a very, very dry humor, though.
Extremely dry. Yeah, absolutely. I think that's part of the reason that I didn't laugh about it until the second time around. I saw some of these jokes. I didn't, like, once again, I'm reading everything as if it's important plot. So I don't think I allowed myself to hear the jokes. And the second time around, when I'm kind of already have the gist of the plot and I'm just listening to their interactions, I realize they're just jokes and they're funny jokes too. But like you said, so dry, they don't even read as jokes many times. Yes.
Nelly, as I was watching it, I thought, I swear Victor told me this was a comedy. So it is a weird type of thing where I do agree with you. There is a lot that's funny there, but not in the way that you normally think of something as funny.
Yes, true. So a couple of things that I think I thought of immediately watching this. First of all, being John Malkovich, which I love, and definitely had a feeling of those Charlie Kaufman movies, Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind as well, but much more so being John Malkovich, especially being in this strange office space.
But conceptually, there's a lot of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind.
Yes.
Right.
Yes. Yeah, exactly. So there's exactly right. And there's also a playing with format that reminds me of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind. As a matter of fact,
Mm.
we'll get into it later, but there's a sequence when she runs out of the hallway and she runs back into the hallway, like that she can only see half of her perception is very much something that feels like something out of Eternal Sunshine, right?
Yeah, and the just the overall overarching concept
Yeah.
of there being part of your history that you don't want to deal with, and
Yeah.
and being able to just conveniently block that out.
Mhm.
Here, I think they take it a step further to say, what if someone else benefits from you blocking that out, and so they can exploit that part of you that doesn't want to deal with that pain, which is very interesting.
Yeah, I agree. All these existential concerns are all in Charlie Kaufman's screenplay. So if you're really a big fan of this and you haven't caught up on all these different Charlie Kaufman films, I mean, I can't list them all, but being John Malkovich, Adaptation, The Eternal Sunshine, obviously, maybe his most popular work, but very much so in line with his concerns, these kind of ideas of identity, very much explored here. And also all those films, by the way, all very, very dry humor. So another thing that kind of overlaps
Mm-hmm.
here. Okay, so to get into the story, there's so much. It's so even in rewatching it, it's so dense. So
So much.
let's try to break this down.
Is this set in the 80s?
That's what's weird about it, right? The style of it is very old technology, but I'm pretty sure this is present day. I'm pretty sure this is present day.
But even the other people seem to be very 80s. The people that are entirely in the current world, like all the cars seem to be 80s. And I don't know. I'm struggling with it. I just like some certainty on this. I wish they had given us some clarification. It might be purposeful.
This is something in the genre recently where you make things that are out of time. They're either supposed to read them as alternate histories, or I think they're trying to not set things in a concrete time so that you can fill in the blanks yourself in a way. And there's been so many of this recently. It's kind of a motif, but I'll just mention one that comes to mind right away. But if you ever saw the movie It Follows, have you seen It Follows?
I have.
So
Yeah.
it follows very much has the feeling of being in the 80s, right?
It
And
does.
and then all of a sudden we see somebody like reading on this like clamshell device, like an e-reader.
Hmm.
And so they do have cell phones and cellular technology, but it's not like an iPhone or something. So it's like was that device that existed in the early 90s, or is this like and
Right.
I think intentionally they don't want you to set it in a time, right?
Here, there is someone with a flip phone. I mean, we'll
Right.
get to right. And so then that confused me because I had convinced myself that it was in the 80s. And then that flip phone showed up, which is certainly, I mean, maybe exists in the current day, but it has not been popular for a very long time. And then I just started thinking, and this is a tangent, about all of the things that people have to do to get around the idea of why didn't you just Google it?
Right.
And wondering, in order to tell stories, you kind of have to create a situation where someone could not have just Googled it
Right.
one way or the other.
I think it's important in a way to bring this up because I think that they are intentionally trying to obfuscate all that. You see these people seem like they are wearing different types of clothes, like the woman who we're going to talk about in a minute because she's like the first thing we see in the episode. She is pretty stylish. She's pretty contemporary looking. Adam Scott's hair does not look very contemporary.
I also agree with that. Yes.
But some of the
worst we've ever seen Adam Scott look.
yes, I agree. But at the same time, given what we find out, maybe he just hasn't cut his hair in a long time because
Right.
some other people on the show don't look like they're as unkempt. Like Patricia Arquette looks pretty styled
Yeah.
for she fits
Agree.
into the current world. At least her persona at work, by the way, not her persona outside. But
Right.
and like you said, we have the flip phone. But for example, that's a perfect example of the technology being off-putting. I, for example, work in technology, and I have worked in offices down in these old mainframes. And the computers we're managing, because these old companies that are 100 years old literally have mainframes from the 50s and 60s. So the technology could look old, but you might still be working on a mainframe screen like they are working here, even though it's contemporary times. I've been in that situation. And similarly, I know people who are so mistrustful of technology that even now flip phones are coming back into style, like as just a choice. But I know like 10 years ago, I worked with people who refused to use an iPhone because they're tracking me. I only use flip phones, right? So they're like total cynics when it comes to technology, even though they work in technology. So it could just be something like that. Like, there's no GPS on this phone, something like that.
True.
So yeah, so all this is, I think, intentionally made to make us ask ourselves these questions. So I have a question right off the bat, which is, at the very beginning, we see this woman, this actress, by the way, who was in High Maintenance, the most recent season of High Maintenance. That's the only thing I've ever seen her in. She was very good there. She had a recurring role, unlike most High Maintenance episodes. She actually is in a relationship with the guy, our drug dealer guy in that show. So she's in a bunch of episodes of that season. And I had honestly never seen her before. And I think she's very good here. They brought it, to be here as one of the main leads. I mean, if anything, she's our entry point to this world, because Adam Scott, being our main POV character, really doesn't ask a lot of questions about this world he's in. And she asks a lot of questions about what's going on around her, right?
Yes.
And she wakes up laying down on a conference table. And apparently this is their regular process. Wouldn't they have a bed or something? Why is this the process? This seems very bad. This is a very bad introduction into this world, I would say.
Yeah, I agree.
And then she has to answer 5 questions, which she does not know the answer to at all, except that they ask her if she knows the names of any states, and she doesn't know the name of Delaware.
And she got a perfect score.
Apparently, yeah, saying Delaware is a perfect score.
Little commentary about what's Mr. Egan's favorite breakfast.
Yeah.
What a weird question. How would I know that? And he says, I know, right?
Right. We see Adam Scott in his car. He's crying. This is his Audi version of himself. So we find out later that the innies are their personas within, and their Audis versions of themselves are their versions outside. And his Audi version of himself is crying in the car. We find out why later on as well. But I thought this was very interesting. He enters into work, and he goes into the elevator, and not only does his persona seem to change, his demeanor changes, the music changes, right? The music becomes very upbeat all of a sudden. And we see him walking, and it's as if he goes through a transformation, like as he walks down these meandering hallways. And he has a tissue in his hand. He's like, why is this tissue in my hand? He throws it in the garbage. He's wondering if he has allergies, if he's catching a cold, but of course it was him crying earlier. So I thought this was very interesting, this kind of change in demeanor. And I think this is the first point in the episode where this metaphor starts to make sense, because we've all had that experience, I'm sure, when you're dealing with something at home and you go to work and then you put on your work persona. And over the course of the day, you forget about this other thing that was on your mind earlier.
Very true.
Okay, we find out here that Petey is missing. He hasn't shown up for work. And this is very upsetting to Mark, Adam Scott's character, because they were best friends at work, and also because this isn't normal, right? They have, and this is interesting, by the way, they have had people scheduled to leave before, but it's all, they have a ceremony and everything. This is not normal for someone to just not show up anymore and just be officially fired. And it disturbs them, as you can imagine, because they don't know any version of this person outside of work.
Right.
They work in macro data refinement, which is something that's very strange, but we'll figure that out later. And that might be a metaphor for the current state of data management. And I'll get into that in more detail later. We meet Peggy, Patricia Arquette, who is Mark's boss, who basically tells him that he's a new manager, replacing Petey. In this whole sequence, by the way, it's very interesting that she says that the board is listening in, but they're always silent on the phone call. It's very creepy. And she's in a new office, so maybe she got promoted too? ? I'm not sure.
Right. Good point.
And then we find out that sequence we saw at the beginning, where that woman was freaking out, John Turturro, Irv, and Mark are the ones who are doing the intake. So this is actually the question that they asked. So we see this from the opposite perspective. Now, this happens many times, by the way, in this show, where you see the perspective of something only from one person's perspective, and then we see it only from another person's perspective. And this is one of the first times we see that happen. This whole thing goes badly. And then Helly, who we find out the character's name, she beans him in the head with a coffee cup and tries to escape. I love that she's in mid-question with him and just beans him with the coffee cup.
Good for her.
Yeah. So then he breaks protocol and he says, you have to ask me one more time to leave. She does, which of course means that he gets to go to this really cool, visually very interesting sequence that doesn't even make sense. It didn't make sense to me the first time I saw it. And then of course in the second episode, it makes perfect sense, where she basically tries to escape by running down this hallway. As soon as she exits the door, she enters back into the hallway, and she keeps doing this over and over again, 3 or 4 times at least. That's her perception. And then she finally comes back and meets up with Adam Scott again, Mark's the character Mark. He goes, yeah, no, you left and you came back. And she's totally flummoxed by this. So she finally just kind of surrenders, and she goes, okay, well, let me just play along a little bit longer to see what happens. And that's when she meets with Patricia Arquette's character, Peggy. And Peggy gives her the video. Now, once again, why is the video the last thing? This should be the very first thing that they see.
Excellent question.
This is a terrible process, a terrible,
I
vexing
have
process.
thought about it. Yes, that is a very good question.
You did this to yourself. Now let me explain what happened to you. Instead of being like, let me ask you 5 random questions,
Yeah.
you wake up in a conference table like, what is happening here? This is a very, very bad. I don't know who designed this process, but it's terrible, terrible process. I didn't pick up on this until the second time around. There's some religious overtones here to the show. So I wonder if this is going to be something, if this is a cult or something somehow. And but we do see that Peggy says this is the first time she makes a kind of reference to her mother and something religious. Her mother was very religious, and she told Peggy when she was younger that there's good news and bad news about hell. And by the way, this episode is called Good News About Hell. And she said the good news about hell is that hell doesn't exist. The bad news about hell is that if people can think of something, they'll build it themselves. And Adam Scott says he doesn't understand that. And I don't really understand it either, because Peggy's explanation is saying that these people that basically people are what makes hell. Like, so these people can make this pleasurable or non-pleasurable. I assume that's Peggy's interpretation of it. But you could also read this as being like, is he in hell? Is he in some version of hell? Once again, I don't mean like a true hell. I mean like, this obviously man-made, but have they created a hell for some reason for these people?
Right.
So we find out some other things here. Mark starts to explain to Kelly some of the rules here, and mentions, first of all, that severance is irreversible. And that seems to not be the case by the end of this first episode, but then maybe it is the case by the end of the second episode. So we'll have to wait and see. Kelly says something very interesting, and this is the second time this becomes kind of a metaphor for work. Once again, our in our current lives, she says, "So I have no choice." Like that, basically we're just trapped here, and we never see the sunlight again, and I have no choice. And he says to her, "Every time you find yourself here, you've made a choice." And I'm like, of course, because whoever's on the outside is showing up for work every day. So there is a choice being made, right? Maybe not by this version of the person, but definitely a choice being made, right?
Mm-hmm.
They could simply not show up, and that would be fine, right? So,
With your outside life. Yeah.
and then when he gets back to his car, he finds a note saying that he had, this is a lie, obviously, that he slipped and cut his head, and therefore they give him free dinner at Pip's Bar and Grill. And Pip's Bar and Grill will show up again soon in this
Yes. He's a VIP.
So then we see him. This is like a segmentation of the episode here. He comes back outside, and we see that he has a very depressing home life. He basically just sits around in the dark and drinks.
Mm-hmm.
He gets told by Peggy earlier on, saying, "You look terrible. Are you hungover?" And of course, he would have no idea if he was hungover or not, because he doesn't have a memory of the night before. But when we see him at home, he probably is hungover because he drinks continuously while he's home.
Right.
He lives alone, but his sister shows up. Oh, and he's also has the first thing this is interesting because it's going to pay off later. It's just that he's constantly arguing with his neighbor, Mrs. Selvig, about her using up all of the space he has for his garbage, because she puts out the garbage and the recycling at the same time. And he's like, no, you put only the garbage out one day, you put the recycling out the other day. Something that I talk to my wife about all the time, by the way. But he has this argument with Miss Selvig, and this is when his sister shows up and tells him, "Did you forget?" So apparently her very strange husband, and I've seen this actor in something before. I have to remember where I've seen him before, but he's always very entertaining, and he always plays this type of character, by the way. But he's this kind of very pseudo-intellectual type character, and he's trying to have a dinner without dinner. So he's having a dinner party, but with no dinner. They just drink water.
Mm-hmm.
And apparently his sister has invited him to this. She's pregnant. She's very pregnant, by the way. She's about to give birth. Part of this is that she's like, oh, you have to come with me to make this bearable. But of course, she also mentions that there's an anniversary coming up, and we suspect this is an anniversary of his wife's death. Is that what you get as well?
Yes.
And then we have this very uncomfortable dinner party, which starts off ridiculous, where people are having these very highfalutin, pseudo-intellectual conversations, which I found very funny, about this whole idea of saying, like, did you know that it was uncouth to call World War One World War One? You're supposed to call it the Great War. And he was a former historian, so they asked his perspective on it, and he goes, well, when it happened, nobody knew it was World War One. You wouldn't know that until it was World War Two. So they're like, oh, of course. But I really love this kind of these type of conversations that we probably all had in our lives, where it's like very intellectual conversations that are kind of very dumb under the surface.
Mm-hmm.
Some jokes are made at Mark's expense about his drinking, and mentions that his father was probably an alcoholic. So his drinking might be something that is congenital. Like I mentioned before, we find out he was a history teacher. We found out his wife was also a teacher, like Russian literature, I think. Is that correct?
Yep.
Oh, and I haven't mentioned this before. The company they work for is called Lumen. From this conversation, we also find out that Lumen is like biotech. They started off in the 1800s apparently as just being like skin salves and painkillers and stuff. And they have now transitioned into biotech. And one of these inventions they have, which I mean, I don't know if it's going to go mainstream or not, considering the contents of the show, but they have something that they're doing in the basement that is so secretive that first of all, they need historians, these people. So it's interesting to see Mark's background being important to the job he does, and that he obviously, his outside self is much more aware of what the job might be. He's opted into this severance process, which is what we're seeing here, where their personalities inside and outside of work are completely severed from each other. There's no shared memory between the two. There's no communication between the two. His brother-in-law, he doesn't actually tell these party goers about this. His brother-in-law is the one who tells them all that he's been severed, which of course is not something you probably want, because apparently this is very controversial, right, in this world.
And the companions are suitably horrified by the news.
They're also very curious, though, right? Everybody seems to, like, he goes on a date later on, which we'll get to, but that's all anybody wants to talk to him about, right? So I think that they are simultaneously curious, but of course, potentially horrified, because I'm sure if you're not in this situation, you're like, well, why would you do this to yourself? And I think we've all been in that circumstance where in someone's company, you would never say, well, why would anyone do that to themselves? That's so horrible. And then, of course, when they're there, they're like, oh, so tell me about it. How is it? So
when he mentions that they stagger the arrivals and departure, the one lady is like, they stagger you? As if that's the worst part of this whole situation.
Yeah, it's so crazy. Like, that's the worst part? Really?
I mean, practically speaking, it's like the World War I thing. Yes, this is only going to work if nobody sees each other.
Yeah, obviously, if you can recognize each other every single day and you become friends outside of work, then there's a lot of risk, much more risk of what's happening, right? Because you can collaborate and figure out ways to potentially crack this code, which is probably what's going to happen over the course of the show. Then we see, after this uncomfortable conversation, we see that he's either making a sandwich for himself or his sister is making a sandwich for him. I forget. She basically imposes on him that he really should not leave. He should stay there for the night. And he does. And this leads to a very funny scene, by the way.
Yeah, very Brooklyn hipster parent vibe there. The explanation of why there need to be 3 beds in a single room, and they're making the sheets themselves, and all very funny. Yeah.
I'm making all the bed sheets myself, so I won't finish with the big one for some time. But the twin is comfortable, and the pajamas were made on a Baltic hand loom, so you'll sleep well.
Thanks. I still don't quite get the 3 beds.
Right.
Oh, Rickon's colleague told us that switching out the beds as the child grows can wound that child.
Irreparably. But if you provide said child with all of its beds upon birth, you allow it to progress across the room at its own rate.
Got it.
Yeah.
This very much is like the kind of parenting books we read when we had our kid, where it's like, they're talking about how, the kids should raise themselves. I'm like, that's not my experience. I'm sorry. So that night, he sees something happen. He wakes up in the middle of the night. He goes outside and he sees a man in a suit in the backyard. This is like snowy outside. He's definitely not dressed for the elements. This is upstate New York, by the way. Again, in upstate New York, just like Escape from Dannemora was shot up there. Escape at Dannemora, by the way. So he sees this character, and we right away, this isn't even a spoiler at this moment, I pretty much was certain that this was Petey, and that's exactly who it turned out to be. But think about that. Petey must have followed him to get to this place, right? He must have been at his house and then followed him here, because obviously he's not at his home. He's at his sister's place.
Right.
It's the weekend, actually. So we see now Mark at Pip's, and Petey confronts him, and he gives him a card to my favorite niece, I believe, something like that.
Yes. And an apology for why the card's not appropriate.
Exactly. Although I'm sure you would make a wonderful niece. And as they're leaving, Mark is very skeptical of this whole interaction and says, "So you're my best friend?" To which Petey responds, "I'm your best friend. You're my very good friend."
I thought it was very funny. Yes.
Yeah. So then, and this is we're at the very end now of episode 1. And when Mark gets back home, finally, we see that Mrs. Selvig is Patricia Arquette.
Dun, dun, dun.
Yeah, dun, dun, dun. And a couple of questions here for you. First of all, is she putting on an accent here? There's a weird accent thing that's happening where she's drifting in and out of this accent.
I found her voice very strange throughout this couple of episodes. I am not sure what she's putting on when, but I found her cadence and her intonation very strange throughout this.
Yeah, there's something very mannered in the way she talks. It's very weird. That's why I had that question for you, because the first time I watched the show, I felt like she did not have an accent at work, but that she had an accent at home. And this is maybe just my reading of things. We'll see if this pans out this way. But now it seems like she has the accent at work, but she hides it mostly. And then she has the accent at home, but she pretty much leans into it more when she's in this personality, which makes me wonder if she is actually severed or
that was one of my big questions after these first couple of episodes, is whether she is just living her normal life with the knowledge of who around her is severed and who isn't.
Right, exactly. Because they obviously know more. Like we see Milchick later on. Same question I have for Milchick, by the way. He obviously knows more than what's happening because he's inside with them, but then he also is intercepting Helly, for example, when she escapes. That there is a boundary, let's say, that he can see the boundary, but is he also severed? Is Patricia Arquette's character, is Peggy also severed? All right, so the second episode is called Half Loop, and we now see Helly doing her intake video, right? So we see her recording the video that gets played for her later on. Obviously very excited about having this job, so she does not seem to have any qualms at all, obviously, as we would expect, because this is quite a commitment to make. So whatever project they're doing, they really believe in it enough to do this to themselves.
Or they're so much pain in some other part of their life that they're anxious to do this. But
yeah, that's an interesting point, right? Because she seems to be enthusiastic about doing this on the principle of the project, as to, like you mentioned, as opposed to Mark, who maybe did this intentionally to, allow himself to. I mean, this is something I forgot to mention in the first recap. He says, at least I don't have to deal with the pain 8 hours of the day. And she says, well, forgetting it doesn't really mean you're dealing with it. It just means you're forgetting it. Right. So
very good point.
And of course, that's the other trade-off of this, is that sure, even if he forgets about it at work, in our actual lives, and once again, if we're going to read this show as a metaphor, and I think that we have to, we've probably had that experience where, you go into work and you forget your daily troubles, but there still is a memory of the two things, right? So you have that continuity, which obviously these people do not. So it's not even like he gets that break from thinking about this, because he's going to be crying in his car, and then a second later he'll be back in his car again, right? Like he doesn't get that break in his mind, right? So
they make that point about how it doesn't feel like they had a weekend because they have no recollection of doing anything on the weekend.
Exactly. There's nothing in between, right? It's, they don't have any of those experiences or memories of them anyway. I mean, they might have some, I don't even know, how does that work when you're dreaming or something, right? Do you remember your dreams when you're inside of there or not? I don't know.
I was wondering that too. And I was wondering that the split is so thorough that it also has split your subconscious, so that in your dreams, you can't any of the other part of your life. Or, for example, John Turturro is falling asleep at his desk,
Yep.
There's no crossover even in your subconscious. It's an interesting question, I think.
Honestly, this remains to be seen, but I think that that's what's interesting there, because it probably is going to be questions that the show wants to address, which is like, what are you as a person? Can you actually segment yourself? And I think that's where things are going to break. I think that potentially the show is going to be about how you can have these segmented experiences, like memories, but segmenting those memories, like to your point, they're not going to change your subconscious. So like, let's say you find out something really terrible about the company outside, you don't have a recollection of that, so it doesn't come to me with work, and it's like, it's still there. You're still going to have some dread or something inside of you because you still have that feeling, right? So, and I think that's something that's going to be explored, and I think that's when you see John Turturro like having this meltdown, that obviously you can't segment things, that saying like, well, if you don't have a memory of it, it doesn't exist. I'm like, I don't think that's how that works. So
exactly.
Oh yeah, so a couple of interesting things here. So Helly, we see her, enthusiastic. We see the procedure, it's a pretty grisly procedure of this like pellet being put into her core of her brain.
Yes, in a lot of detail. We saw that.
Yes, exactly. Which reminds me of another film which I wouldn't recommend right now. It's called Possessor, which is a fascinating film, but a pretty rough watch. So I'll leave that to another conversation. Although it's a really fascinating film about persona also. And then we see something very fun here, which we see the opposite of her exits that we saw from the first. So I thought this was great, because even, like I said, even the first episode, I was confused by what we were seeing, even though I thought it was visually clever. But then we see the actual physical thing happening, right? So as soon as she walks through that door, she goes into her other persona, and that other persona wants to go back in, right? So it's this little tug of war between these two parts of her, which I found very like the way they illustrated that was really well done.
Mm.
Oh, and then it's interesting here. I mean, they obviously say this to her only because they want her to convince her to go back in. But they say that, they're so impressed that they have her there. She's
Yeah.
like a rare find or something. So it does make me curious to know, like, what's her background on the outside of the world that she is such an ideal recruit for whatever this job happens to be.
Yes, and a lot of humor too in the job of you've got to identify the number that looks scary.
Yes, this is very, very funny. I'm going to definitely excerpt it here because both scenes are funny and we'll get into it. But when she pretends to find the scary number, it was very funny. Yeah. And then when she does find the scary number, is very, very funny.
Yes, I agree.
So then after she decides to go back in that final time, we actually see the credits for the first time. No credits the first episode. We get credits here. And the credits are very disturbing, by the way.
Mm-hmm.
Basically, it's an animation of these two versions of Adam Scott's character. And at some points, like, he's being swarmed by different versions of himself and stuff like that. It's very, very creepy. Having not seen them the first time, so when I finally saw them in episode 2, I'm like, did that happen in episode 1? I don't think I remember those credits from episode 1.
Same.
I think I would have remembered. Oh, yeah. And then, like you mentioned, now this is her innie again, and she's talking to Mark. And Mark says, well, yeah, the weekend just passed. And she goes, I've only been here for 8 hours. And he goes, well, actually, the whole weekend passed in between. And she goes, wait, I don't have any memory of that. Absolutely not.
That's how this works.
And I did think about something, once again, drawing the parallels to this in our everyday lives. I've had the experience when I've gone on vacation for like 3 weeks. I remember that time we went to Portugal, actually. I was out there for a while. And by the end of the vacation, I literally remember being like, I can't imagine like logging into a conference call when I get home. I don't even remember what I do at day to day in my job. Like, you've basically completely disconnected from your work self. And then all of a sudden showing up for work. And by the middle of the morning, you are like right back you're back in the jargon, you're back in the flow, you're back in the meeting state, you're back in that persona again. And it's as if that 3 weeks of vacation has just collapsed down into nothing.
Yep.
So it's very weird, but I guess that's probably the experience these people have continuously.
Yep.
So that's a place where I think this is metaphorically rich. Another thing I'm going to excerpt here in the audio, and this actor's name, but the guy who plays Dylan, who was on your show, he was his assistant at his bookshop.
Yes.
The thing I remember him from the most, by the way, is just one single episode of Succession where Roman is in training.
Yeah.
And he's like his buddy there. And he's only that one episode of the show, but, very memorable. So I guess he's the type of guy who ends up getting work from these very memorable roles. This is a pretty big role for him. So I don't know if he's had a big role like this before. But anyway, very entertaining. And he has some of the funniest lines here. He's a stand-up comic, I think, originally. So that kind of speaks to his timing and such. But I did love when he's talking about all the incentives that you get. And I do think that it's like, this is very much, once again, corporate culture where people are so fixated. I knew people like this. I'm sure we've all had experiences like this, where there's someone in the office that they give you these little tchotchkes and stuff like as motivations that are so corny. It's like something like a holdover from grammar school. And some people are so vested in this crap. And he's like, you get a caricature of yourself. And he's got a lot of those because he's one of their best employees.
Mm-hmm.
But very important here, Helly mentions that, well, what about Mark's cube, that head, that glass crystal cube? And apparently that is not a regular incentive. Mark has done something so exceptional at some point that they gave him this special recognition.
I'd comment, I'm not sure if it was in this episode or the next one, about the erasers. They're nice to have, but we have no purpose for them because we don't use pencils or something like that, which is very all corporate culture type of thing of like, have you even thought this through? Why would anyone want this or need this?
And this is where we find out that the job they have is that somehow this macro data, which once again, this is very funny, me working in technology, because this is the world we're going in with AI and things like that. They are looking at data sets, but those data sets aren't even explicit data anymore. They have been like pre-processed and they literally are just digits on the screen. And they have to look at these digits. And somehow there's some skill they have specifically, these people, where they can see these quote unquote scary numbers. And and Helly has so many funny reactions to this. And the first one, she says, scary, what do you mean? Are they bloody? Do they chant? Some other interesting things here is that she says, well, what if I just decide to quit? And he goes, well, you can quit by just not coming back. And he goes, but why would you want to quit? He says to her, this is Mark at this point, saying to her that if you quit, you're basically killing this version of yourself, which once again made me think about the decisions we make in our work lives. Because that is true, right? Every time you change jobs, you fundamentally we are fundamentally different people at home and in each one of these different personas we put on in our interactions in life. So honestly, unless you have a very, very similar job to the one you had before, that as soon as you exit one job and now you go into a new corporate culture and you meet new people and you have new job requirements, you really no longer are the person day to day that you were in that other job. Of course, we have memories, so we have continuity. We don't actually kill that person off, but it is interesting to think about them as a separate person and how you were making a decision to end that part of your life.
One thing that is really interesting to me about this idea of severing your personal and work life is, we talk so much in our society now about work-life balance.
Right.
And I definitely have zero work-life balance. Listen, I could enforce better boundaries than I do. But the truth is, as I'm watching this show, my email is pinging and I'm checking and thinking, okay, let me add that to the to-do list. And litigators, at least, we work on things when we have time to work on them. And maybe during work hours, it may not be. And you don't want to forget to tell somebody something. So you'll just email it around at the time that it crosses your mind. And that might be at 3 a.m. It might be at 11 a.m. on a Saturday, whatever. What was really interesting to me, I guess, is the idea of being able to entirely split that into two different portions of your life, because I think that's how it used to be, right? Back the earlier part of the 20th century, and where it wasn't so easy to get in touch with us when we weren't in the office anyway.
Probably before the BlackBerry, right? The BlackBerry was kind of what really broke that boundary initially.
Yeah, I guess you could still bring home work with you, but it's not the same as interacting with other people who are telling you they need things and want things.
Right, exactly.
I feel like in that way, I don't have too much of a separation, and maybe because, I do a very specific thing in being a litigator. So it's not like my new job is going to be all that different from my old job. It's a different context, but the skills are the same. The work is the same. It's just a different context. I don't know how to say this in a way that's not in poor taste. Once at the beginning of the pandemic, my husband walked in on my conference call and heard me talking to case team that I was on about something. When I came out of the room afterwards, I don't know a nice way to say this, except he told me, you were talking like you have a penis. And so I thought, no, to me, that was just me on a work call. But I guess to him, that was a different side of my personality that he had never seen, which is weird because I feel like I'm pretty assertive in real life, in my personal life as well. But I guess the way it was coming across was something new to him. So to your point, I guess there are, as interwoven as I feel it is, there are certain parts of ourselves that only our work life people know.
Yeah, I think that's actually very interesting. Something I hadn't thought about here. I was purely reading this. My metaphor was different. I'd say, I'm reading this as, like you were saying, this person you are at work, the person you are at home, how these things are so separated from each other. But you're right that technology, especially now post-pandemic, and I'm sure this was written before. I mean, it's probably shot before the pandemic or at the beginning of it. So this was not, pandemic in mind. But when you think about how the pandemic has forced everybody to work from home and how our personal lives and work lives have just bled together now, you literally have newscasters with their kids running around the background while they're doing the weather report, right? So it's inevitable that these people's personal lives are bleeding into their home lives. Like your husband had not seen you in that version of you, that persona, because Sona, because he hadn't been in the company of that person before, but now that person is home, right? So that's interesting, right? Because it's we're dealing with this forcing that person. Those two worlds are colliding. But it's also interesting what you're describing, and maybe that's where this show almost feels set in time. This very much does feel like pre-BlackBerry. I remember when I started working in technology, that I had to carry a pager around in case of an emergency, right? So it was literally you left the office and that day was over unless you got a pager, right? And then when you got the page, you needed to get on the phone. And what was so funny is that we didn't even have the software installed on our home computers to be able to do all the work we needed to do in case of emergency. So really, it was getting on the phone and talking someone down. And if it was a true emergency, you had to come into the office to fix the problem, right? Honestly, my wife's in medicine, and that's kind of the world they live in. And they carry pagers around until very recently. Now they basically have an app called OnPage, which is a pager, even though it's on their mobile device, right? So it's hilarious, but some of these processes are still extremely antiquated because they've been around for so long. So I think that it's interesting that this show is dealing with this in a very explicit way. And then what you're touching on, which I think is really interesting, that it's almost like that world doesn't exist anymore. So now what does happen when these personas have to interact with each other, right?
Yes, exactly.
Then back in the show, we see this very awkward team building exercise, which I thought was this ball that gets passed around.
Yeah, I mean, talk about darkly funny.
Yes.
It reminded me very much of all the times that I have been demanded to tell a fun fact about myself.
Yes, yes.
And every time I think, why don't I just keep something in the notes app on my phone so that I have these fun facts as a go-to? Because God, I hate having to give fun facts. I hate listening to everybody's fun facts. These facts are very rarely any fun.
Yep.
And I can't stand the forced nature of the whole thing.
And this is explicitly that. I mean, my most recent job, I worked at a startup, and we had do fun facts whenever a team member joined, but it wasn't only the team members' fun facts, it was, to introduce ourselves to them. So we had so much turnover in a startup, like we were giving fun facts about each other 2 or 3 times a week. It's like, I don't have that many fun facts. But I did find this very interesting that, when she says, I don't know anything about myself, so I can't participate in this. And Milchick says, oh, come on. Like, don't, Milchick being this kind of facilitator who, once again, breaches both sides. I've never seen this actor in anything before, and he's very good because I'll just call it out now. I find it very fascinating that he is very kindly, very paternal, and still very menacing at the same time. It's a very interesting energy that he has. But he is, once again, doing exactly that, where he goes, oh, come on, Helly. For example, like, you are this tall, which makes you the 3rd tallest person in our team, right? And it's like a caricature of just how superficial these quote unquote fun facts are. And once again, this idea that when you're at work, you don't really want to talk about, like, this is what I do on the weekends. This is who I'm married to. This is how many kids I have. Like, maybe you're friends at work, but you don't want to be public about all this information. So you have to make everything so superficial. And this is like the most obvious version of it, because all they know is what's happened inside that office. They don't know anything else.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, and we find out a couple of things here. Supposedly, they have the ability on these elevators and all the exits of the building to be able to identify any text or code, as they call it, any code that would leave the building. I do like, once again, Helly, very funny, getting these very dry, funny lines here in her frustration. She goes, first of all, she doesn't believe it. She thinks it's bullshit. And
it does.
Yeah, it does sound like bullshit, right?
Yeah.
He goes, well, what if I draw it like really squiggly lines, like those robot tests? Would it still catch it? And of course, Mark tells her, don't try it. But the second very important thing we learn here is that Mark admits to the fact that he hid some pictures at the very beginning of the episode, by the way. He hid pictures that had Petey, and they were going to have the new team photographs that day. And he felt upset about Petey just disappearing. So he had hidden those pictures, and that was not correct for protocol, apparently.
It out by printing out the portion of the office manual that says that was improper and presenting it to Mark, which is also a very Office Space type of feeling to me, that type of joke.
Well, this is Irv, right?
Yes.
Another very important thing we find out here, by the way, is that he said that for all they know, Petey is dead because, he's no longer there. And that's very upsetting to everybody. They said, well, why are you upset about this? Milchick says to them, Carol D left, right?
Mm-hmm.
And they go, yeah, but Carol D, that was planned. And we saw a video from her outside her Audi, right? So that's interesting because, so in other words, there is a way out. I mean, all you have to basically, your Audi just has to say, I want out, and you're out. So it's strange that these people are trapped there because their Audis don't care enough about them, basically, to release them. So that's the first thing that's interesting. They're not truly trapped there if their Audis just basically ask for their exit. And the second thing that's interesting here is, once again, Milchick's stern, sometimes warm father figure, sometimes menacing character when he's telling Helly, not getting the exercise correct, which is about to set her off. But before we get there, I do have a question for you, which is that he suggests that they all eat their melon. They get to have a little melon party, and then take a picture before the melon bloat kicks in. Is melon bloat a thing?
Well, I guess maybe some water weight. There is a lot of water in melon.
There is, true. And sugar, so that could make you bloat.
Yeah, I mean, I personally It seemed to just be honeydew and cantaloupe, which for me would be very disappointing. Maybe some watermelon in there. Maybe throw, I know strawberries are not a melon, but maybe they could add a few strawberries. I would not be personally all that excited. Although maybe the work version of me loves melon. I don't know. It could happen.
There's definitely when you're at work, because given whatever is available in the snack bar or whatever, that there are things that I only ate at work I wouldn't necessarily eat at home.
Right. I remember once we had a work celebration of some sort, and there was a cheesecake, and someone was very disappointed that when you say you're having cake, it shouldn't mean cheesecake. And I said, well, any cake in a storm, right? Like,
Better than no cake, right? So
that is my point exactly. So maybe in this scenario, I would love honeydew. I don't know.
I do love cheesecake though, so I can't really go against that.
Same. Yeah. I mean, I don't have any complaint about it. I actually would probably prefer cheesecake to say carrot cake, which to me is not even really a cake.
All right, so then Helly during the team picture, it's a little bit of like a Stepford Wives moment where she's like looking at everybody, smiling at the camera, and Miltrick being like, smile everybody, and they're all laughing, and she's kind of like, okay, I need out. I need out. She writes, I quit, I believe, on a piece of paper, and storms towards the elevator.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, this supposed BS that the scanners can know when you've written something on paper apparently works. I don't know how this technology would work, but it does work.
I don't either.
Mark rescues her by saying, oh, she's my trainee. She didn't know. I forgot to tell her. It's my bad. This is all on me, which means that Mark goes into the break room. And when he enters the break room, Peggy is there. And we find out a little bit more about the break room by the end of the episode. But he goes into the break room and he has that experience, like when he transitions, like when he it's like a TV signal cutting out that happens on the show multiple times. So when when they transition from one persona to the other, this happens. So they go into the break room. So my question is, if he doesn't remember the break room, this version of it internally has a cutoff when he enters the break room. And then when he hears the audio recording later on of somebody in the break room, and I don't know if you know who that is, but we'll see if you do know, that when he hears a recording of the break room event, his outie is not familiar with this either. So where do those memories go? How many of these segmentations do they have?
I did not realize he was being segmented in the break room. So that's something that I didn't pick up on. I totally believe you, though. I just hadn't picked up on it myself.
So the next thing, when that moment happens, that weird cutout occurs, we see that he's on a date with his sister's doula, right?
Mm-hmm.
And of course, they have some cursory conversation. He's getting drunk again, drinking like crazy.
Mm-hmm.
They try to have a regular conversation. He's not really paying attention to her, and she's not that interested in his conversation until she starts talking about Severance, which of course is what all anybody wants to talk about.
Mm-hmm.
And she asks him some questions. We find out, for example, that all the housing is supplied by Lumen, which is not uncommon for some of these big corporate complexes.
Right.
Which also explains why Peggy lives right next door to him. Things go badly. They run into some protesters, some teenagers who are protesting this like enslavement of these inner selves. Yeah. But Mark does take a lot of offense to this. First of all, he's saying they're too young. They don't know what they're talking about. And saying, how can you enslave somebody? How can you enslave yourself when you're the one who's making the decision yourself? So once again, that does open that question of, what responsibility you have to this part of yourself when we have the situation where we rationalize that time we spend at work because we have that continuity. But if we didn't, like, what are we doing to that person, that version of ourselves that are trapped in there?
Yeah. And as we're talking about it now, I'm thinking, kind of just generally questions of bodily autonomy that we do deal with in real life. For example, should people be allowed to sell their organs, right, or, something like that? How much is a moral judgment that we are placing on other people that is taking away their right to do what they want with their own bodies?
Yeah, this is a totally separate story, but it is interesting to consider. He actually brings it up here. He says to this protester that his past self was the one who brought him here. So did this past self like impose this on his future self? And that's actually a very interesting, it's actually a philosophical question that's been asked throughout time. This idea that, for example, imagine you drink too much when you're young and you party too much when you're young. And then when you're older, you have like liver cancer or something. So your previous version of yourself, who does not have to deal with these consequences, has done this to the future version of yourself. So it's almost like, what do you owe that future version of yourself? Right. And vice versa. If we experience time in a different way, then, imagine we could actually experience our whole lifetime at once, that you obviously would make very, very different decisions in your youth.
Mm-hmm.
He gets home. Miss Selvig is there. Mrs. Selvig, she brings him cookies.
with chamomile in it. It was strange.
Yes. And he makes this, he like says, oh, these are so good. But from his facial reaction, it looks like there's too much chamomile.
And she knows they might be bad too. She
Yeah.
acknowledged.
But chamomile is supposed to help you sleep, right? She just trying to knock him out? Maybe she's drugging him. Who knows?
Maybe. It hadn't occurred to me till we were talking just now, but maybe.
So she calls out the fact that, hey, that light bulb's not going to change itself. He's letting the house kind of get run down over time. And he does go into the garage after she leaves to find a replacement light bulb, which he finds instead is a candle made by Gemma. Is that his wife? I would assume his wife?
Yes, they had mentioned her name earlier as well.
Oh, they did. Okay. So I always had a question mark as to whether Gemma was his wife or like whether he had a daughter or something, but that just confirms it. I was assuming just a wife. So by the way, going all the way back to that card he got from Petey, Petey said, if you want to know more, come to this address. So the next day on the way to work, he calls in sick. Does he call on his phone? So that's Bluetooth in the phone, right? I mean, in the car, right?
What a good point. I had completely forgotten about that. Yeah, must be. Yeah, really interesting. Why are they all driving such old cars then?
Good question. Good question. But one possibility is that I know people who worked upstate New York for like Bausch and Lomb would live on campus for certain periods of time. They would have cars available. So I can imagine maybe, if it's some economically depressed upstate New York town, it could be that the cars they lend out are not the newest cars. Maybe they're just giving out the oldest. They might have these cars in rotation for a long period of time.
Maybe. They're really old though, but maybe.
I think it's intentional, by the way. I think it's a style choice, but it's but still it raises that question, I guess.
What I thought was crazy is that given the setup of all of this, I would think that they are tracking him all the time some way.
Right.
So I thought the idea that he could just call in and there would be nobody verifying, yeah, he really is homesick. I found that very unbelievable.
I'd say, yes, it does seem that they probably are tracking him to some extent. I mean, as a matter of fact, we see Miss Selvig is checking in on him just that night through her window. So maybe that is how they are having them snoop on each other, potentially. That's one way. But the other thing I was thinking is that maybe they don't need to because they are afraid of some kind of blowback if, in popular culture, if people have more questions about this. And it's possible people can police themselves in, trapping themselves by choice inside of this circumstance that maybe they don't need to. In other words, my point is maybe PD is the first time this system has actually failed, but it remains to be seen. Oh, so he calls in sick, and he goes and meets up with PD, who's staying in some greenhouse. Is that right? Behind some house.
Like it.
Oh, but a lot of really interesting things happen at work, even though he's not there. First of all, we find out about this break room. Irv has some kind of episode. He's afraid of having to be sent to the break room, but they say, well, before we send you to the break room, let's have you check in with this counselor that they have. And before we even get to that, we find out that only 1/5 of all of these files that they're processing ever get completed before they quote unquote expire. So that's interesting that this is time boxed data somehow. And we find out, this is from Dylan once again, we find out that their success rate was even lower until Mark had some kind of freshman fluke, they call it. So it was some kind of something that he did that earned him that reward. I'm assuming here that that's how he got that reward, but that he discovered something in this process. And that's why he got that reward. But maybe he hasn't been as high an achiever since then. So maybe that's why they're so curious about him. But, this is all my suppositions at this point. And Dylan seems to be a little jealous of that, just in his commentary here. And this is right around the time, as this conversation is happening, is when we see this very disturbing image from Irv's point of view. Oh, earlier on, by the way, we had seen that Irv had dirt under his nails. I just want to call that out because, this is obviously something that's happening when he's home, but that is curious to know what is happening outside of the house because we have not seen Irv outside of work.
Correct. Maybe he's a gardener.
It could be, exactly. Oh, maybe he's a gardener. Oh my goodness, the greenhouse. Do you think he's staying behind Irv's house? That would be interesting.
Oh shoot, hadn't thought of that.
Just thought of it. I just thought of it now. So these things might tie together actually. So
maybe.
And then Irv gets sent for his wellness check. And then I'm definitely going to excerpt this, by the way. This is when we have this funny sequence after Irv goes off to get checked up. Helly goes, oh God, a 4.
Oh God, a 4.
Don't fuck around. I told you, you'll understand when you see it, so just be patient.
What even are these numbers? Like, do we even know what we're supposedly cleaning?
My theory? The sea.
The sea.
Yeah, think about it. Okay, if our Audis are up there severing their brains, shit must have gotten pretty bad. Famine, plagues, etc. So what is a desperate humanity to do?
Populate the sea?
Populate the sea. But first, they gotta send probes down to the sea to clean up all the deadly eels and shit, because we can't cohabitate with that. So we send the probes down, they send us the data coded, we sense what's eels, and then we tell the probes what to blow up.
This is the leading theory?
Now, Irv thinks we're cutting swear words out of movies.
Which made me laugh so much because I'm just thinking, could you imagine that they're like, that these people are like, sacrificing their lives for removing curse words from movies? Seems a little extreme.
It does.
So then we see, this is another very funny sequence for me, which I didn't laugh out loud about until the second time around. Once again, I must have been very tired. This is the end of the second episode, the first time I watched this. But I laughed so much about this whole sequence. He goes to his wellness check, and he's in the hallway, and he sees a painting of, once again, another religious looking image. It looks like Moses or something, or maybe it's Gilby or somebody. But anyway, he's whipping a goat. And at this moment, we see that Christopher Walken, who's the head of optics and design, walks out from his wellness check. John Turturro, playing Irv, says, "Oh, I miss this painting. It used to be in the community room." And he goes, "Oh, it got moved here." They go, "We thought it would be better here." To which Irv goes, "Yes, I think it does work better here. It's very calming." A goat being whipped is a very, very calming image. Maybe that says something about their personas. And then Christopher Walken says, "Oh, he didn't want to take credit for it." He goes, "We don't paint them. We just hang them up."
Right.
And he goes, most people only get excited not by their paintings that they hang up, but only by the tote bags that they design. So this guy's in charge of like all the, the swag and stuff around the building as well. And Irv, of course, is a big fan of the tote bags as well. So that's apparently looking forward to that. But the really funny sequence, that was a little bit of funny. The really thing that made me laugh the most is when he goes into his wellness check.
Your Audi is generous. Your Audi is fond of music and owns many records. Your Audi is a friend to children and to the elderly and the insane. Your Audi is strong and helps someone lift a heavy object. Your Audi attends many dances and is popular among the other attendees. Your Audi likes films and owns a machine that can play them. Your Audi is splendid and can swim gracefully and well. I'm sorry. Please try to enjoy each fact equally and not show preference for any over the others. That's 10 points off. You have 90 points remaining.
Points?
Please don't speak.
Points? Him just saying points the way he said points made me laugh. He was so shocked by the fact that they were deducting points for this experience. Please don't speak. As soon as he says points, she goes, "Please don't speak." Oh boy, this whole thing made me laugh a lot.
Crazy. So crazy.
Then we see Dylan is getting some snacks, which these are just a little details, but I want to include them because it's just speaks to how much detail they put into this world. They buy snacks with tokens. They don't actually have money, and they're supposed to, on their honor,
Two per person.
Right, two per person. That's right. And then Irv returns, and he says, "Oh, we had a great experience." And he says he met Bert, which is Christopher Walken's character. And I love Dylan's responses. "Bert's a fuck. You didn't tell him where we are, did you?" And Irv's response to this is, "Bert is not a fuck."
Right.
And he goes, "Don't act like you care about this department. You just want your waffle party." And at this moment is when Helly finds her first scary numbers. This is great also.
Okay, don't do it.
Hey, guys.
Lumen has been good to us, and it is feckless.
Guys? That.
Yep.
Why is it
You okay? Just fence off the bad data like I showed you.
Can you see the perimeter?
And bin it. Boom. Fucking refined.
All right, Helly. Hip, hip.
They were scary. The numbers were scary.
And then her reaction when they walk away and they go, good job. She's like, those numbers, they were scary.
Yeah.
They were scary. And then we get to the end of the episode. We find out, this is still the end of that day off. We find out that Petey's staying with Mark. We see Peggy looking through the window. She doesn't see anybody, but she sees the light on. So it remains to be seen. If she knows he's there, we don't know that she knows, basically.
Mm-hmm.
Once again, I ask the question, is Selvig and Peggy, are they separated, right? Severed. But if she's not, then she knows something is going on.
Right.
And then we end on a very disturbing image where
yes,
Petey is in the shower. The phone starts ringing, and this seems to activate, maybe because of, maybe there's some signal cross current or something, seems to activate the device in his head. So this deseverance has not gone smoothly. And he even says that. He goes, I'm the first one. He goes, I have severance disease earlier on. And he says that I'm the first one to experience it, basically.
Mm-hmm.
So apparently this is not common at all. But this whole sequence is very interesting because, and once again, speaks to almost like something out of Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind as well, where, you see Jim Carrey's character walking through his memories because he suddenly is having this episode and talking to Mark through the door. And then he looks in the mirror and he sees another version of himself already inside the shower, right? So it's very discombobulating, obviously. And that's how we end things heading into next week.
I am intrigued.
Yes. And I would say what's interesting, as long as these episodes are, is that these are long episodes. They are not rushing at all. They are taking things very slowly. If anything, these episodes easily could have been 10 or 15 minutes shorter. They choose to make them long. Every scene kind of is long intentionally. But I wanted to see another episode, not necessarily because I'm like, ooh, I'm on the edge of my seat, because I'm just so intrigued. I'm like, what happens next? Like, where are they going with this, right?
Exactly. I agree.
So I'm glad you liked it. I honestly wasn't 100% sure whether you'd be on board with this because it's a little too out there.
Yeah, it's basically at the limits, I think, of where I can be with this type of show. But I see a lot of different possibilities for where it could be going. I guess depending on how those possibilities develop, I may decide it was more than I bargained for. But for right now, I am very intrigued to see where it goes.
I don't know if this is going to scare you off or not from the show, but this show is intended to have a second season. They haven't officially gotten the green light yet, but it's intended to have a second season. But what I would say about that is that critics have seen the entire show. And it's not like they get to the end, it's like Lost or something where it's just like another big mystery for next season.
Right.
The reviews are saying that I've read, just cursory, have said that the ending of this season, the finale, the last couple episodes, are edge of your seat, terrifying. There's a definite conclusion to this season.
Okay. Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, that definitely makes me more interested to keep going. If I had thought they had no plan and this thing at the end, kind of like Lost, where they're they get to the end and they're just
figuring it out as they go type of feeling. Yeah.
Right. But even when you think about season 1 of Lost, which I really did love, by the time they get to the end, they're like, we have to find out what's inside that bunker. And it's like, that's not the mystery. Tune in next year, so.
Yeah.
Very much on board with this. That wraps it up for this. And I am very interested to see what happens next. We will be covering the next episode of After Party. We're very close to the end now. I do think we will be covering another episode of Severance. And time permitting, Sona will try to watch that No Exit movie as well. But we'll be covering those next week.
Cool.
Make sure you subscribe so you know when these episodes become available. And we'll talk to you soon.
Talk to you soon. Bye.
Daydream, I fell asleep amid the flowers for a couple of hours on a beautiful day. Daydream, I dream of you amid the flowers for a couple of hours. Such a beautiful day.